Our next guest today is Jason Watson-Todd, co-founder of Terravita, a creative design studio focusing on landscapes, interior design and architecture, which is what brings us to today's spot here in San Lorenzo to take a tour of Ibiza's very first zero-carbon house, Can Tanca. Jason, welcome back to the Amar La Tierra podcast.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back with you.
It's great to have you with us again and to be talking about your other passion, which, as well as growing things and nurturing them, I gather that you also love architecture. So what is it that you love about the housing on Ibiza specifically?
Well, in relation to the Ibizan architecture, I love its simplicity and its kind of the way it works, kind of like cubes in different volumes. I think it's really beautiful. And obviously all houses on Ibiza have always been white. And there is a certain magic to seeing the hillside dotted with all these little white houses. In relation to Ibiza's architecture, if we're going back in history, just the simplicity of it. They would use lime renders. They would use natural stone. They would use stone, make the walls out of stone. They would use wood. It would all be natural materials, and they were very well insulated. So in the summer times, it would be, very, very cool when you'd go into the old homes.
I think that's kind of why the White Isle got named the White Isle, right, from the whitewashed walls.
Exactly. The La Isla Blanca, the White Island, comes from Ibiza's white homes in that sense. That's kind of the distinctive mark of Ibiza, that all houses were painted white.
So what is it, you perhaps see with, obviously there's many benefits of the old finca style building, but what is it, perhaps that are the flaws of the style of housing that we see here?
Well, the modern style of housing that we see here, the flaws are basically they're not energy efficient and they're not very environmentally friendly. And that's where I've been focusing on, is trying to design and build energy efficient homes, environmentally friendly homes that kind of have that fusion with nature, where there's that balance between the modern world and the natural organic world.
What sort of drove that desire initially? Was there something that maybe you observed or witnessed in the past that kind of made you feel like it was that moment in time that we really need to start changing the way that we live?
And the desire just arose from having a deep respect for nature and wanting to do things as best as possible. And from that, it all spiraled out into designing kind of healthy homes.
When did you first become interested in designing buildings? Is that something that's always been there on the back burner, aside from the kind of landscaping and the gardening? Or is it something that, has always been maybe something that you always wished to bring to the fore of your work?
Well, I've always been a very creative soul, so I think that's kind of been the foundation of who I am. And in relation to houses, I think that arose around probably 10 years ago or so, kind of this passion to build beautiful homes.
Here at Can Tanca, and obviously, you've been living here for about 7 years now, but what was it like when you discovered this piece of land?
When I discovered this piece of land, it was abandoned farming land. I think it had been abandoned for around half a century, 50, 60 years. So what had happened over time is the pine trees started kind of eating back into the old farmland. There were some old terraces, fig trees, almond trees, a couple of olive trees dotted around. But like I said, there were certain areas of the farm that where the pine trees had kind of encroached back onto the land. So I removed them and started fixing the old stone walls, pruning the trees, and kind of bringing it back into that kind of authentic farm feel.
That's very interesting you bring that up, because I think, in episode 1, that's what Vicente Palamet was referring to, this idea that, a lot of the farms were abandoned sort of 50, 60, even 70 years ago when tourism started to arrive, and, the forest just basically kind of comes and takes over.
Exactly. I think when there was that kind of, when there was that kind of that big change where suddenly the tourism came in and all big portion of the island suddenly got abandoned. And pine trees, within 10 years, they can encroach on the land really quickly. And if you'd look at the photos of, there are some aerial view photos, I think, of 1956 that Americans took, most of the island was just covered in terracing. It's actually quite interesting to look at those photos. And even when you see all these green forests, within those green forests, it used to be terraced, farmed. And if you kind of walk through it, you'd be surprised to see the little treasures that are there. It's like archaeology. You're kind of sifting through the sands of time.
Is that what the terracing's for then, to kind of differentiate between the pieces of land and to stop the pine spreading?
Now, the terracing was basically purely to do with farming and kind of controlling when it would rain to steer the water into certain areas, into certain terraces. And it was mainly for dry crops, for almond trees, fig trees, carob trees, also wheat and things like that. And they would farm in the most unusual places on the edge of a cliff. You may find an old stone wall. So very, very interesting how they managed to survive over thousands and thousands of years on this island. And then suddenly there was that enormous change. It was like, the clash of two worlds, the old and the new. And the new took over, obviously, and the old kind of got hidden, but it's still there. And if you have the energy or the courage to kind of get lost in the forest, you'll be surprised. You may find some old farmhouses, or like I said, old terraces, or old spring wells and things like that. Really, really interesting.
So, I mean, you're hearing now the rustling of the fig trees. We are sitting actually right underneath one, surrounded by these beautiful old stone dry walls that you refer to. Was that the first thing that you restored when you arrived here?
It was one of the first things that I started restoring, exactly, is fixing the old stone walls. And I also put in some new ones, because that's the kind of the foundation for the farm, for the landscape, in that sense.
Can you tell us how one, what's so significant about these dry stone walls? Because you see them, as you just said, all around the island, and they're, something that you really associate specifically with the Balearics.
Well, a good question. I mean, it basically boils down to, they were very practical in the olden days. It was just purely to do with farming, and obviously to get the right gradient of soil, so there's not too much of a slope. You'd create your terraced walls, and that means that the soil would be kind of horizontal and much better for planting and working the land in that sense. And also to get when they would start recuperating certain areas, they would, let's say the stones that were on the fields, what would they do with those stones? They didn't have trucks or machines to get rid of them, so they would end up making stone walls in all areas.
Yeah, I love the fact that, they're obviously making use of the things that they find on the land rather than just dumping it, because, the building industry itself is one of the most polluting in the world. So I think it's, very interesting to kind of explore this idea of, creating more sustainable living. And, from making the stone walls, what was it that gave you the initial idea to create a place like this that's zero carbon, and how does that work?
What gave me the idea of creating this home was, one is to be, I love the idea of being self-sufficient. If I have the privilege of being on Ibiza, being born here, so I wanted to obviously make my own home, and if I was going to build it, I wanted to do it as environmentally friendly as possible. For me, that was a very important factor, and also as energy efficient as possible. So the combination of those two, let's say the fusion of energy efficiency, because like you said earlier on, a big proportion of the problem that we have is the buildings that we've made over the last half a century, or even further back, are not energy efficient. So it's like an enormous gas guzzling car to actually heat and cool a building. If it hasn't been built correctly, it's it's a money guzzler. And a lot of people don't ask themselves the question of when they buy a new home, or even when they design and build a new home, they don't ask themselves the question, how much is this house going to cost to run? But you do ask that question, for example, when you buy a car, you want to know how many liters, per X kilometers. But we don't do it for houses, and a lot of houses are so energy energy demanding that it's just bonkers. It's really crazy in that sense. So, for example, this house consumes around 90% less energy than a conventional home. Okay, you have to make that initial effort at the beginning to do the maths, to do the research, to spend a little bit more money. Maybe you spend, I don't know, around 10% more or something like that. But the payback is pretty much immediate. And then you're not stuck in this constant loop of running these homes that are just burning fossil fuels in some way or another constantly. This home is completely off-grid, independent, running off solar, very energy efficient. All the materials that I've chosen are very environmentally friendly. Even if the house gets knocked down in 300 years' time, I've thought about that it's easy to recycle. So I've used a lot of wood within the structure, which obviously holds CO2, and in the future, very easy to recycle. So I think the whole process of how things get recycled a couple of hundred years down the road has to be thought of, because in the moment that we're living in, let's say in this time, it's criminal the way we build and design things without forethought as to what happens to it down the road, and we're just drowning in rubbish. It's criminal, it's crazy, it's suicidal, but as long as we can't see it, we just kind of don't think about it. But it's still there. All the rubbish that's been produced over the last 50 years, it's not gone. It's buried somewhere. It'll be interesting to see in the future with archaeologists a couple of thousand years down the road. They'll probably look back at us and think we were crazy the way we had this with our relationship to nature. So I think there's got to be a big change there in how we see nature, because before, for example, we build homes to keep nature out, but nature's not a threat anymore. It's time to welcome her back. It's to create this union and this fusion with her, and have this deep respect for her biophilic approach, which is that fusion between nature and architecture. And you can do wonderful things when one puts their mind to it. Human beings are very resilient creatures, and we can do amazing things on the opposite end of the spectrum, things that are unconceivable in all senses. In that we're still having wars is just mind-boggling. It's like we don't evolve as a species in that sense, and it don't get you anywhere. And it's very sad to see that we haven't evolved in certain areas, but at the same time, if we keep it positive, there are a lot less wars than there used to be. That's for sure. A lot less. So we are evolving slowly but surely. But I think we have to make an enormous change in a very fast time period to get to grips with really what's happening. Because let's say in relation to climate change, we've all been kind of putting it in the back cupboard and ignoring it, but it's becoming more and more difficult to deny it, because you can feel it. Before it was, supposedly the Earth's going to warm up and blah blah blah, but now you feel it. You're conscious of it. The weather patterns are very different. Suddenly it's extremely cold, and the next minute it's extremely hot. or it's raining at the wrong time of the year in Spain. And this year has been terrible, the droughts that they've been having. And suddenly the rains came much, much later than usual. So in that sense, we have to get our things together. And waiting for our governments to make those changes doesn't work. The change has to come internally. And when you get that mass, then that change will happen. But it can't be someone else will deal with it. One has to make the little changes that one can, and that has a tsunami effect. You could bring an enormous multinational company down by not buying X product. Suddenly, if we're aware of that, it gives you cancer or something like that, people change. They don't want to buy it. So that where does that change come? It comes from the individual. It's not really the other way around. It has to come from within, and I think we all have to do our part. Some can do more, some can do less, but always keeping in mind the importance of taking care of our earth, and we have to be stewards towards her instead of trying to conquer her. And we've done it, and we can kill ourselves in the meantime if we want to. But I don't think we're that silly. I think that the change will eventually come, or at least I hope so.
I think that's your little dog, Bimba, trotting around on the pebbles.
Around on the pebbles, yeah.
I think, yeah, so many points to unpack there. But, starting off with the fact that it's almost like a rebellious act to be living in a house like this that's completely off grid. You're not using the water supply here, as you said, and you're not using the electricity, which in a moment like we're in now, because of the rise in the cost of living globally, that's a really amazing place to be.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier on, I do have the privilege of being on this little island that I had a plot of land, and when I built my home, I did build it, putting in an enormous effort into just doing the best that I can with the resources that I have, and there is definitely an enormous satisfaction knowing that I don't have to pay an electricity bill, and that the sun gives it to me for free. Knowing that I don't have to pay a water bill with rainwater harvesting, the water recycling, and the well that I have, kind of fusing all of those things together. Then the vegetable patch, which is an enormous pleasure. But it does require effort. You have to go out there, you have to plant, your tomatoes, you have to tend them. You have to put a certain amount of effort into things.
I think it's interesting what you mentioned at the beginning about the harvesting nature essentially to power the house, which I feel is the future, and that's kind of where we're moving towards. But Spain historically actually had like a tax on the sun at some point in the past with solar energy, and I feel obviously that's changed now, but it's almost kind of dug its heels in and been one of the slowest European countries to evolve in that sense, in terms of, I think it was only a couple of years ago that only like 8% of Spain's energy was coming from solar power, which is like nothing compared to how much harvesting of the wind that we've done here, for example, which is just utter madness considering how much sunshine we have.
Yeah, I think it's, you use the right word there. It's madness, it's crazy, it's bonkers. It's just, it's so illogical that it's actually difficult to grasp. What happened there is greed, multinational greed trying to make more money, and they came up with this. It was kind of a tax the sun concept, impuesto del sol, they called it here, which was basically cutting as much as possible you using renewable energies. So you're basically stuck on the gas guzzling oil system, and well, there was a change in government. The new government came in. Obviously, the new government luckily thought it was crazy as well, and they change the laws. But that's where you see the madness of human beings and how a couple of people can make decisions for the masses. But you have to rebel. I think it's really important. You can't just sit there and moan about things and complain. You have to be the change that you want to see. And that's really the key, is having the courage to kind of to step into the fire and be that change. Because otherwise we're not going to make that change. As I was saying earlier on, that change has to come on an individual basis, and then it becomes a tsunami.
I think that's, very interesting to observe the way that Spain has kind of changed those laws. And obviously things are moving in the right direction at the moment. I think there's even subsidiaries available for people who have solar powers and can then power a neighbour, for example, which I think is a really beautiful move in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the interconnected grid. There's so much possibility on that sense, and that is, it's really hopeful. That's the advantage to technology. In that sense, technology is a double-edged sword. It can be used for great evil, and it can be used for great good. And you can by interconnecting things, and if you've got excess power, you can shoot it back into the grid, or you can give that energy to a neighbor, and that's beautiful of working together as a small community, and then as a larger community, then as an international community, and to stop arguing so much and actually get our stuff together and use logic, because we all yearn the same things. We all love our friends, we all love our family, we all love our communities. It's the same wherever you go in the world, and we all have certain human values wherever you are, and it's just to tap into that the good side of being human.
I really love what you said earlier about, this idea of bringing nature into the home, because I think, that's how we all want to live. This idea of living in these concrete boxes, disconnected from nature in big cities, because obviously we have to make use of the space is insane. And obviously we're in a very privileged position, as you put it, of being here in a wonderful plot of land surrounded by, stunning nature. And why would anybody want to live in a place like this without bringing that kind of sensation of nature into the home? It's kind of, the best way to exist if that's available to you. But I think, like, by the very nature of describing Can Tanca as a zero carbon house, obviously that's one that doesn't emit greenhouse gases, or specifically carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. So how does that actually work?
Well, let's say the home, firstly consumes a very, very small amount of energy to heat and cool, and then that energy that I need comes from the sun. It produces more energy than it consumes, so it's kind of very fruitful in the amount of energy that this house gives off. So if you look at it kind of in a organic manner, it's constantly breathing oxygen back in instead of carbon dioxide, instead of emitting carbon dioxide in that sense. And how's that done? By just doing the maths, and being very conscious of the type of materials you choose, the making it as energy efficient as possible, and just trying to be aware of your actions. What is like sitting down and really thinking about, if I do this, what happens in a year from now, or what happens 50 years from now? And it's relatively easy to do. It's just a question of connecting back to nature. I would put it that way. Is we've spent enough time trying to conquer her, and it's just the other way. And also just using to our advantage all these great technologies that we have. I'm not saying let's not embrace technology. I think it should be embraced for the good of the planet and for the good of mankind and for good of all the creatures that live on this earth. Is use that our intelligence to a mutual benefit for all parties.
No, couldn't agree more. I think there's only one way to have a happy life, and that is to be in tune with, and in harmony with your surroundings. And that's definitely how it feels sitting right here under this fig tree. I mean, how did the architecture of the house get designed? Who was responsible for the actual making or creative work behind the house?
The architecture, it was done with a good friend of mine, Kit, he's running a company called Bloom at the moment. And we basically, Kit and I did it together. I mean, a lot of the design was down to Kit, but we kind of we worked hand in hand, and just thinking about how the light works, how the air moves through the building, how we shade the building, and all of those things. It was a very interesting process, and that's when you kind of put a lot of conscious love into what you do, into your work, into your creations. It's just doing things, I would say, with presence.
I think one of the things that I really feel from having taken the grand tour is that, the garden is obviously your finest work. It's beautifully landscaped. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's a lot of, bees flying around, and I can hear a lot of activity all around the house. And obviously you've got your veggie patch, as you said before as well. I mean, I think that's kind of a responsibility if you do take on a piece of land like this and put a house on it. This podcast is really a lot of the focus and the attention that we want to share is the fact that, as you said before, land custodianship is part and parcel of taking a piece of the land and making it your own on an island like this one.
Exactly. I think you have to be a good steward. When we're not going to go back and start living in caves, we have to be realistic in that sense. But if we are gonna, if we do have a house in the countryside, you have to be aware and conscious of the repercussions that has. And you can, instead of imposing, let's say, your architecture on the land and your landscaping on the land, instead of it being very aggressive, it's just fusing with the landscape and creating these little microclimates, creating, having plenty of flowers for the bees and natural water source for the birds and things like that. And then then nature just does her thing. You don't really need to do much. You just need to gently help her here and there. And you don't even need to do that. But if you do have a home in the countryside, it's just to be aware of how you can enhance things. Let's say the slight negative effect. Okay, you have built a home within an old farming land, but you can do a lot to actually improve that negative and turn it into a lot of more positives, a lot more pluses than negatives in that sense.
I think putting something back, into the land, if you're going to take something from it, essentially that's what it boils down to. It's about balance. And if you're going to create, a structure on the land and shut down some of its capabilities of restoring the environment in its immediate vicinity, then yeah, it's just about give and take.
Exactly. It's about give and take. It's about recycling. It's a constant recycling process. But we've just been taking for hundreds of years, and the earth it's not an infinite resource, and our mind frame and our whole system is based upon as if though it's infinite on this constant growth. The numbers don't add up. We're always about how much how much extra profit a company's made or a country's made, and it doesn't work like that. At one point it will collapse because we just don't have the resources. And then you have to just change your mindset and go back into that recycling of just that constant give and take. It's finding that balance.
How easy was it to set all of this up, in terms of like deciding that you were not going to be connected to power source, water source, and to kind of, make a conscious decision to go off grid? I mean, what brought you to that point? How difficult was it to get to this stage where you are now, 7 years in, of living a life in harmony with nature and not really taking anything from, the kind of official resource points?
It's been very, very challenging at times to actually get this far. It's not been easy. It's been, it's been difficult for many reasons. When you're doing something that's kind of so unusual, you're kind of going against the current in that sense, and that does require kind of courage and determination and will to just keep on chugging away. There's times I could have, thrown the towel in many times because it was tiring to get, for example, to get the BREEAM certificate was really, really difficult. Just the paperwork involved and all the checks that BREEAM had to make sure that you do everything, correctly was taxing. And on the Passivhaus Premium also, wasn't easy. But the end result is a very energy efficient home and a very, very, very environmentally friendly home. And I could have gone the other way of just building conventionally and just doing things without any forethought to anything. Probably save myself, 10 or 15% less on the financial side. But if we think like that, then we're in a bit of trouble. I think if one has the possibilities, make that extra effort, and you can feel it. You step into a home like this, and it's like that fusion, that mix of all those ingredients. It's like if you're going to be making a great paella, okay, you've got the ingredients, but if you don't mix them in correctly, it will taste horrible. Same on the design side. If you don't mix them in, all of them in the right proportions, it won't work, and you'll feel it. We're intuitive creatures. We can step into a building, like sick building syndrome, and some of them is literally sickening. I remember 15 years ago, I wanted to buy a flat, and I walked into this flat, and I literally felt physically sick because it was. I'll never forget it. It was so badly designed, with no forethought for the human being that was going to live in that building, that I just was like, this is just crazy that this still goes on. And you can design and build wonderful, co-housing flats and homes just with a bit of love and care and dedication and forethought and keeping a certain balance.
For sure. I mean, congratulations on jumping all through those hoops, because I know that Spain does love to do a little bit of paperwork, particularly on this island as well. So that must have been a Herculean effort to get the certification. But what does it feel like to live in a house like this? You say you walked into a place that made you feel physically sick. What does living in a house like this feel like?
Yeah, good question. It feels calming. It feels like being at home. You walk in, it's like I can relax, I can let go, and it's that space that's been designed and created with all those proportions and formulas to make that happen. It just feels soothing, relaxing.
Yeah, which is just not, a lot of people's experience in this lifetime, to kind of live in a very minimal impact kind of way. But I think on an island like Ibiza, if there's anywhere that you want to appreciate nature and be in tune with it, it's definitely here. So well done you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for joining us here under the fig tree in your fabulous home at Can Tanca.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.